Ready? Good morning, students. And good morning, Bill. We're so fortunate to have Bill Graham as our guest speaker for today. There are two classes here, Bill. My class, Beatrice Sexual Politics University, and Rachel's class. What is the title of your class?
Specific issues.
Specific issues. So, we'd like to thank you for saying yes to our request for you to come and speak to our students and share your knowledge about local issues in the Marshall Islands. So before he starts, can we give him a hand? Bill, all yours.
Okay, thank you. Just by way of brief introduction, I spent 21 years working as the public advocate at the Nuclear Claims Tribunal from the time that it was established in 1988 until I retired in the summer of 2009. And we will, if you have read through the Section 177 agreement, you have some idea of what the tribunal was established to do. So that work gave me a lot of exposure to information, experience, and knowledge about the testing program, both from listening to Marshallese who had claims before the tribunal, and also working with scientists, medical doctors, and attorneys who were associated with the tribunal in the process of hearing claims. What I'm going to talk about today will be very brief about just the atomic and nuclear weapons testing program. You've probably heard already during your courses a little bit of the history. The very first atomic bomb was tested in Alamogordo, New Mexico in 1945. The second and third atomic bombs were dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, and those basically helped bring an end to World War II, in the Pacific anyway. The U.S. military realized that these weapons, these new atomic bombs, were more powerful than any weapon that had ever been used before in war, and they needed to have a better understanding of how they might be used, and in particular, how they might be used against a fleet of ships, military ships. So they brought more than 90 ships to Bikini, anchored them in the lagoon, after, of course, moving the Bikinians to Romerike for the good of mankind. I'm sure you're familiar with that little story. And dropped an atomic bomb from a plane over this fleet of target ships anchored in the Bikini Lagoon. Very similar type bomb and very similar type delivery system dropped from an airplane over Bikini in the first test of what was called Operation Crossroads in 1946. That was the fourth atomic bomb in history. The fifth atomic bomb was tested a few weeks later. It was anchored underwater, 90 feet below a target vessel, and it was codenamed Baker. And you've probably seen, if you saw the poster or the banner outside the ICC last month when the Nuclear Legacy Conference was going on, you see a picture of the Bikini Lagoon and this big column of water coming up out of the lagoon, and then a big mushroom cloud starting to form. That's a photograph of the Bravo test in July of 1946, the fifth atomic bomb in history. That gave the U.S. some information about how devastating these weapons could be against a fleet of military ships. But they needed more information, so they then, in 1947, moved the Eniwetok people to Ujalam so that they could conduct what they called Operation Sandstone in 1948, which were 3 atomic bombs that were the 6th, 7th, and 8th atomic bombs in history. Later they began doing some testing in Nevada, but when the scientists came up with a new technology, a new and improved, more powerful weapon, a more powerful bomb, a hydrogen bomb, which was now called a thermonuclear bomb, they realized that this was far too powerful to test in the U.S. at their Nevada test site out in the desert. So they again came back to the Marshall Islands, and at Eniwetok in November of 1952, They detonated the world's first hydrogen bomb, or thermonuclear bomb, codenamed Mike. It was a very powerful bomb, but for some reason they couldn't track where the fallout went, the radioactive fallout created by the detonation of the bomb. But they were very impressed with the power of this. Later, of course, we had the test codenamed Bravo on March 1st, 1954. That was the most powerful bomb the U.S. has ever detonated. It had an explosive equivalent of 15 megatons. That's 15 megatons of TNT. TNT is dynamite. It's what was used for many years in wars to blow things up. But if you have 15 million tons of dynamite or TNT, it's going to make a very big explosion, and that, of course, was the situation with the Bravo test. You know that after the Bravo test, the people of Rongelap and Utrecht, who were exposed to heavy fallout, of radioactive fallout, of debris from the Bravo test, when you detonate a bomb on the surface of the Earth, it creates a fireball. And especially when you have a thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb, that's a very big fireball. And it sucks things up. It creates a vacuum and it sucks up into the fireball the plants, the trees, the rocks, the lagoon water, and in some cases entire islands, as was the case with Bravo. You can find a big crater in the reef at Bikini where an island used to be. It was totally blown up. And all of that island, all of the sand, rocks, plants, and everything else like that, were sucked up into the fireball and irradiated by all the irradiation that was created. Went up to over 100,000 feet high. That's 20 miles high into the sky, the mushroom cloud. And then the debris began to fall out. And the smaller pieces would stay aloft longer period of time. They might go into the upper atmosphere and fall out gradually all around the Earth over a period of many years. But the bigger, heavier particles would fall out more quickly. And this fallout came down on virtually all of the Marshall Islands in different degrees, different levels. The most highly concentrated fallout fell on Rongelap, and the people there had to be removed to Kwajalein. Also, there was heavy fallout at Utrecht. Those people had to be removed. They had planes that they sent from Kwajalein to go around and monitor the levels of fallout that were happening following each of those tests in 1954. Bravo was the first of 6 tests in Operation Castle in 1954. And the planes would fly from Kwajalein all around. One plane would go over the Radak chain and one would go over the Radak chain. And they would fly down to an altitude of 200 feet when they approached an island or an atoll. And they had a radiation monitoring device in the underside of the plane, and they would take radiation measurements. A secret report of those measurements that was declassified and made public in 1994 showed that there were measurable levels of radioactive fallout at every atoll in the Marshall Islands. The most, of course, at Rongelap, second most at Utrecht. Ailuk was also fairly heavily exposed, and there's a story about the Joint Task Force 7 that were conducting Operation Castle at the time saying, hey, our aerial monitoring, our plane that was flying over the islands taking radiation measurements, early after Bravo, they said the intensity, the level of the fallout at Ailuk is about the same as at Utrecht. The decision had already been made to evacuate the Utrecht people, 160 some, and the Rongelap people had been evacuated, some by plane, some by ship. Now they're saying, what about the Ailuk people? And the High Commissioner of the Trust Territory at the time said, oh my goodness, you military people are really making things difficult for us civilians who are administering this Trust Territory. You've already moved the Bikini people and the Eniwetok people to atolls that are not easily occupied by people. They cannot support those communities. So they have become very dependent on the Trust Territory to help provide them with food. Now you've already moved the Rongelap and the Utrecht populations, 80-some people from Rongelap, 150 or 60 from Utrecht. There's 400 people on Ailuk. Leave them there. And the good news is that the fallout intensities at Ailuk dropped off. And so ultimately they were not as high as at Utrecht. Bad news is, the Utrecht people were on Kwajalein for 3 months following Bravo, when a lot of that fallout was coming down on their atoll. The Ailuk people were still on Ailuk, subjected to that fallout. Anyway, it's one of the many unfair aspects of the settlement of the damages from the nuclear weapons testing program that maybe out of ignorance or maybe out of arrogance, a lot of things that could have been done to help the people of the Marshall Islands, to protect them from exposures, were not done. So the testing program ended in 1958, and the U.S. provided some funding for people of Bikini and Eniwetok. Over the years, they provided some funding for the people of Rongelap and Utrecht over the years. But eventually, the people of Bikini said, we want to go back to our island. And they had been allowed to go back in the very early 1970s. U.S. President Lyndon Johnson declared that Bikini was safe in 1968, and they began building houses so that the people could move back. Some members of the Bikini community left Kili and moved to Bikini, 1969, 70, and others followed in 71 and 72. And there was a community of about 100 people, I think, living on Bikini in the mid-70s. Scientists and medical doctors were going to Bikini, taking measurements of the radiation there, also doing medical examinations and taking specimens, body specimens from the people. And by 1977, they realized, oh my goodness, these people have been eating and drinking food, coconuts and other food, growing in the soil, in the dirt at Bikini. They had never done a cleanup of Bikini. They had only removed old vehicles and other things that were rusting to pieces. They had never done anything to remove the soil that still contained radiation. So as the people were eating food and drinking coconuts, growing in this radioactive soil, the radiation was going into their bodies. And by 1978, the scientists said, oh my goodness, this population has ingested the largest amount of cesium-137 of anyone we ever knew about. They need to be moved. So most of those people were moved from Bikini in 1978 over to Edgeot Island, where they continue to have a very significant community. That got the Bikinians kind of mad. They said, well, you said it was okay for us to go back, and there was no environmental study, no environmental impact study, there was no analysis of how radioactive the island was. So they began to file lawsuits. They got an attorney and they began to file legal cases in courts starting in Hawaii. And that began the process of the U.S. saying, oh, well, we have to do something about this because they have a good case and they could win. So negotiations began on a settlement agreement that would be part of a compact of free association. And the settlement agreement, which I think you have copies of the Section 177 agreement, that was finally signed in June of 1983 by then President Amata Kabua on behalf of the Marshall Islands and an ambassador from the United States named Fred Zeter. In Section 177 of the compact, it's just 3 short paragraphs, it says that the government of the United States accepts responsibility. Accepts responsibility. We have the responsibility for compensation owing to the people of the Marshall Islands for loss or damage to property and person of its citizens resulting from the nuclear testing program. Goes on to say that the Marshall Islands and the U.S. would set forth in a separate agreement provisions for the just and adequate. Just means justice. It means fair. Fair and just. The just and adequate settlement of all claims for damages to person and property resulting from the nuclear weapons testing program. And it also required that the U.S. would provide to the Marshall Islands a nuclear claims fund in the amount of $150 million. So what I want to talk about right now are some of the aspects of the settlement agreement. And if you have a copy in front of you, or you can look at it, I'm going to start off with Article 1. of the Section 177 agreement. Article 1, Section 2, paragraph A, which talks about the government of the Marshall Islands shall cause the fund to be invested with the performance goal of producing for each year of its existence average annual proceeds of at least $18 million for disbursement in accordance with this agreement. So this is one of the misleading, one of the unfair parts of this settlement agreement. If you have a fund, $150 million. The fund is supposed to stay invested. You buy stocks, bonds, you buy shares in American companies, and you hope that those investments will increase. They will produce dividends, they will increase in price so that you will have annual proceeds. So if the $150 million is supposed to produce maybe $18 million per year, that means that you need a rate of return on your investment of more than 12%. If you take 12% times 150, you get 18 million. But the reality is, as was indicated in a report done by the United States Government Accounting Office, because $150 million was turned over to the Marshall Islands in December of 1986, following the compact coming into effect, and the first distributions to the 4 atolls and to the 177 or 4 atoll healthcare program began in January of 1987, you did not have a full quarter in which to earn money to distribute. So they had to make distributions. So actually, the fund would have needed to return 12.5% per year. If you go to Bank of Marshall Islands or you go to Bank of Guam and you put money into a savings account, who knows what kind of interest rate you will get? Do you know what percentage interest those banks are paying these days? Maybe you can get 6 if you commit to leaving it in for a long time.
You're lucky if you get 2, it's usually.
Yeah,
like
2 or 3 is normally
two
what you
and
would
some
get for a
percent.
savings account.
Yeah.
So this 12.5% return, in order to generate $18 million a year, every year, because you have to give the bikini people $5 million every year, you have to give the Enoeta people 3-some million every year for this 15-year period beginning in 1987, 86. If you have to earn $18 million a year, you need this rate of return of 12.5%. If you don't earn 12.5%, then you have to start taking money out of the $150 million to make those required distributions. And that reduces the value of the fund so that next year you now have to earn 14 or 15% in order to generate $18 million a year. And what happened was that in order to make the payments of $18 million a year, almost every year they had to take money out of the main fund, out of the $150 million. So that after just a couple of years, the value of the fund was down to $132 or $135 million. Actually, just in the first year, it was reduced by that amount. Because there was a big adjustment in the US stock market in October of 1987. The value of stocks went way down. So the value of the nuclear claims fund went way down. The point is that from the Marshall Islands perspective, the agreement says you're going to get $18 million a year, every year, in perpetuity, forever and ever. And that's the agreement that was signed in June of 1983. At that time, in June of 1983, the Marshall Islands was still part of the trust territory, and it was getting total budget allocation for all of the Marshall Islands, for education, health, all government activities, a total of about $11 or $12 million a year for all government activities. Now you're saying, we're going to give you $18 million every year, forever and ever, to pay for personal injuries, property damage, health care, anything that's related, any type of damage from the nuclear weapons testing program. So from the Marshall Islands point of view, we're going to be getting $18 million forever and ever. Okay, sounds like a pretty good deal. What happened, unfortunately, was that at the end of the 15-year period, payment of $18 million every year, the fund was down to about 42 million. And at that point, there was no hope that he would continue to pay $18 million a year. Just 2.5 years, you would have used up that 42 million. The tribunal continued to make awards of compensation, and we will get into the tribunal awards in a few minutes. But that's one aspect of the Section 177 agreement that I think is particularly unfair to the Marshall Islands. Nobody here, our negotiators, did not understand that it was mission impossible to try to earn $18 million every year from a $150 million fund. We didn't have financial advisors working with us at the time, so we said, oh, well, okay, if we can earn $18 million every year, that's great. Another aspect of the Section 177 agreement that I particularly think is unfair is in Article 7. Article 7 says that the U.S. is relieved of responsibility, relieved of and has no responsibility for, and the government of the Marshall Islands shall have and exercise responsibility for controlling the utilization of areas in the Marshall Islands affected by the nuclear testing program. So the U.S. is saying, we wash our hands of all responsibility for all those areas that were affected by the nuclear weapons testing program. Let's just talk about one particular island. It's the island of Runin in the atoll of Enewetak. When a partial cleanup of Enewetak was conducted by the U.S. using both military personnel from America and civilian workers, Marshallese, Kosraians, Gilbertese, that were brought to Enewetak to help during the cleanup. They removed radioactive debris, soil from some of the islands in Enewetak, and they put it on a barge and took it across the lagoon to Rulit Island, where there was a big crater, a big hole, where an island had been blown up by one of the bombs that was tested at Enewetak. And without putting any cement or any kind of liner in the bottom of that crater, they just dumped all of this debris, a total of more than 110,000 cubic yards. Let's just say this table was about 1 cubic yard. A cubic yard being a yard by 36 inches by 36 inches by 36 inches. So 110,000 cubic yards of highly radioactive material dumped into this crater and then covered over with a concrete dome. You may have seen photographs of the big concrete dome at Runin. They call it the Cactus Containment Facility. Cactus was the name of the bomb that made the crater. And containing, it's supposed to contain all of this radioactive material underneath this dome. But what has happened is, it's been discovered that a lot of that radioactive material is leaching out through the reef and getting into the lagoon, getting into the soil. Fish that are in that area of the atoll can be eating some of this radioactive material that's leaching and leaking into the lagoon. And you know, those fish, there's no sign there that says fish don't eat anything in this area. There used to be a sign at Runin that said danger, keep out. But the sign isn't there anymore. A recent development, just within the last few years, a Chinese businessman has opened a store on Inaweta where he sells rice, sugar, and other things to the people, and he will buy copper. The Inaweta people have not been able to make copra because no one will buy their copra because it's got radioactivity in it. But these people have figured out that when the atomic and nuclear weapons were being tested at Inaweta, they had copper cable, just like your TV cable used to be, or your telephone cable, running from one island to the other, all around the atoll, and especially at Runin. There's a lot of underground cable that were connecting, so they could sit on one island and push a button and detonate a bomb at the other side of the atoll by sending the signal along this copper cable. And some of the Inuit people have figured out that they can go over to Runin Island and they can dig up this copper cable and they can sell it to the Chinese businessmen. In doing that, they are digging into radioactive soil, and in particular, sand and soil that was not buried under the dome that contains plutonium. Plutonium, once you start digging, even a small particle of plutonium dust up into the air, you breathe it in, it goes into your lungs, it starts to expose you to its radioactivity. If you get a little bit on your fingers, under your fingernails, you put it in your mouth, you ingest it. And so Inuit people are being exposed to plutonium when they go and dig copper cable at Runin or other islands in Inuit. Last year, the RMI government wrote a letter to the Department of Energy and said, we would like you to work with us to help prevent the Inuit people from going over there to dig up copper cable. And the U.S. Department of Energy replied saying, not our responsibility. We don't do that. It's your problem, basically. I don't have the actual wording in front of me, but so when we talk about this utilization of lands in Article 7, let's take the most knowledgeable country in the world about the effects of weapons testing and radiation, and they say, well, we're not responsible for all those areas that we made radioactive. You, government of the Marshall Islands, who have no scientists, who don't really understand these things, you're responsible for this. To me, it's a shameful part of the settlement agreement, which is supposedly going to provide just and adequate, fair settlement. And yet we say, oh, Marshall Islands, you're responsible for all these affected areas. The third and final part of the 177 agreement that particularly bothers me is in Article 8. We know that the U.S. government, once they were being sued in U.S. courts, and the U.S. judges were saying, hey, these Marshall Islands people have a good case here. You went out and you tested all these atomic bombs and nuclear bombs in the Marshall Islands. You left all this radioactivity behind. You're not doing any cleanup. Yeah, we're going to hear this case. We're going to hear these claims that they're bringing. So eventually in 1978 to 1980 or so, after the Bikinians had been removed, after it had been realized the Bikinians ingested all of this cesium-137 from drinking and eating coconuts and other food plants, they conducted the Northern Marshall Islands Radiological Survey. It was only 13 of the northern islands that they surveyed, but of course they did Bikini, Inuit, Rongelap, and Umduvik, and many other atolls. And Article 8 of the Section 177 agreement says, The Northern Marshall Islands Radiological Survey and related environmental studies conducted by the U.S. represent the best effort of the U.S. government accurately to evaluate and describe radiological conditions in the Marshall Islands. And paragraph B, that survey, the Northern Marshall Islands Radiological Survey, have been made available to the Marshall Islands and can be used for the evaluation of the food chain and environment and estimating radiation-related health consequences of residing in the Northern Marshall Islands after 1978. So we're telling you, here's the radiation situation in these islands. Here's how much radiation is at Island. Here's how much is at Lithia. Here's how much is at Midget. I think Midget was included. And you can use this information to determine how this radiation is going to move from the soil, from the dirt, through the food chain, the food that is being grown in that soil, into humans, and you can then estimate what the health consequences are going to be from residing in those islands after 1978. Excuse me. We're talking about now exposures that these people will be receiving from eating contaminated food from 1978 forward. What about the medical conditions, the illnesses, the exposures that they received prior to 1978? What about the exposures they received from the Bravo test in 1954? How are we supposed to estimate the health consequences from those exposures? You're keeping the data secret. A lot of that report that I said from the aerial monitoring following Bravo and the other tests that were conducted in 1954 as part of Operation Castle. That report was secret until 1994. This agreement was concluded in 1983. And the U.S. is saying, oh, see, we gave you our best effort to determine what the radiological conditions in the Marshall Islands are, and you can use this information to estimate what the health consequences would be from 1978 on. I don't know if you've ever seen people do a magic show where they fool you into thinking that they did something that they really didn't do. It's just an illusion. Part of many illusions is to draw your attention to something away from where they're doing something else. And that's exactly what the U.S. is doing. We're drawing the attention of the people of the Marshall Islands to the health consequences of living in the Northern Marshall Islands and eating food grown there from 1978 onward. But the real most important exposures that people have that are going to create a lot of the medical conditions, all of the thyroid conditions, came from exposures that were received during the period. Thyroid exposures result from exposure to radioactive iodine, in particular iodine-131. It has a very short half-life. Within a year or two, it's completely eliminated from the environment. So thyroid problems that were caused by radiation from the weapons testing were the result of exposures received no later than 1960. Many other exposures, you go to the history books, you look at a young boy who was a year old at the time of the Bravo test, living on Rongelap. His name was Luggage Anjay, 1 year old. He had thyroid conditions. He was treated for the thyroid conditions by the U.S. medical doctors that were looking after, taking care of, and studying the Rongelap and Usarik people. And then after his thyroid condition, he developed leukemia, and he died at the age of 19 in 1972. His exposures did not come from residing in the Northern Marshall Islands after 1978. His leukemia, which the U.S. admitted, yes, this was obviously a result of his exposure to radioactive fallout at Rongelap in 1954 when he was 1 year old. Many, many other cancers and other medical conditions resulted from people's exposures, even perhaps going back to 1948. One of the experts that worked for the tribunal, worked for my office, the Office of the Public Advocate at the tribunal, was a world-class medical doctor by the name of Edward Radford. He had just graduated from the Harvard Medical School in 1947 or 48. And in order to pay for his tuition that he had borrowed money to go to school, he joined the U.S. Air Force. They had something called the GI Bill that would enable people who were in the service to help pay for their tuition. And as a young Air Force lieutenant, he was sent to Kwajalein in 1948 as a doctor during the testing program called Operation Sandstone. He told us during one of his visits here that during one of those 3 tests in Operation Sandstone, all 3 of those tests were at Eniwetok, hundreds of miles away from Kwajalein. He went over to the radiological safety office and asked the RadSafe officer, "Hey, what do you want me to do?" The guy said, "Oh, hey doc, here, take this Geiger counter. It's a small machine that measures radiation. And just walk around the island and see if you find anything." So Dr. Radford was responsible for the flight crew for one of the planes that was taking movies of the test that day at Eniwetok. So the airmen, the Air Force soldiers that he was responsible for being their doctor, they were out at Eniwetok on a plane. So he's wandering around Kwajalein. Many people, military people, were living on Kwajalein in tents, the enlisted men. And as he was wandering around the area that is now the golf course near the runway at Kwajalein, it started to rain, so he ducked under the flap of one of the tents so that he would get out of the rain. And as the rain came down and started streaming off the tent, the Geiger counter, the radiation monitoring device on his belt, started clicking, telling him there's radiation right where you are. When the rain passed, he took the Geiger counter back to the radiological safety officer and said, "Hey, this thing went off. I want to know how much I was exposed to." He never found out how much he was exposed to, but that was clearly an indication that there was fallout. He described it as a rainout event because the rain brought the fallout down on Kwajalein. Maybe it would have gone on, stayed in the air and gone into some other place. Maybe it would have just fallen out in the ocean. But it fell out on Kwajalein at that time, a rainout fallout event from a small test at Eniwetok. Now, in 1948. That was one of the smallest of the 67 tests that were conducted in the Marshall Islands. 40 kiloton, 42 kiloton, 42,000 tons of TNT. 18 of the tests that were conducted here in the Marshall Islands were megaton level devices. Bombs that had explosive power of more than 1 million tons of TNT. So a small 40,000 ton device tested on Eniwetok in 1948 did cause fallout at Kwajalein. And the U.S. has always said, "Oh, Kwajalein, oh, those people were unexposed." Huh, right. And the definition, the U.S. definition of exposed and unexposed has always been and continues to be to this day that if you were living on Rongelap or Utrecht on March 1st, 1954, we consider you exposed. If you were living anywhere else, you were unexposed. Pardon me, that's just nothing more than a lie. So that's another part of this whole deal, that you can predict the consequences of the nuclear testing program from 1978 forward. That's just one way of distracting your attention from the real source of exposure, those exposures that took place during the time of the testing. Within hours and days of each device being detonated, there was fallout in various places across the Marshall Islands. Okay, I think I've got a little more time. We'll try to get through this presentation. We go until 12:30, is that right?
12:25.
Okay. If you look at the 177 agreement, you can see in Article 2, the distribution of annual proceeds. There's $30 million, $2 million a year for the first 15 years of the compact for healthcare programs. There's $3 million total for medical surveillance and radiological monitoring activities. the RMI government conducted its own radiological study from 1990 or so to 1995. That's a long story. Section 2, $75 million for the people of Bikini. Section 3, $48 million for the people of Eniwetok. Section 4, $37 million for Rongelap. Section 5, $22 million for Udrich. Section 6, money for the establishment and operation of the tribunal, and $45 million for the tribunal to pay awards of compensation that it would make for the claims that it approved. And Article 4 talks about the claims adjudication process. With Section 1, there will be established by the Marshall Islands government a claims tribunal which shall have jurisdiction to render final determination upon all claims, past, present, and future, of the government, citizens, and nationals of the Marshall Islands which are based on, arise out of, or are in any way related to the nuclear testing program. So, okay, fine. Let's see. How do we bring up this?
Just click on the PDF emblem there in the bottom row.
All right.
This is it?
Yep.
Okay. And then page down. Page up, page down. Okay. This is the seal of the Nuclear Claims Tribunal. And what I'm going to present now is a brief summary of the jurisdiction and the compensation awards which the tribunal made. And what I just read to you, that the Claims Tribunal shall have jurisdiction to render final determination upon all claims, past, present, and future, of the government, citizens, and nationals of the Marshall Islands, which are based on, arise out of, or are in any way related to the nuclear testing program. Instead of the U.S. courts hearing these claims, which U.S. Court of Claims had been hearing claims from 14 different atolls for damages resulting from the nuclear and atomic weapons testing. As a result of the settlement agreement, all those claims were dismissed from the U.S. courts. The U.S. courts no longer had jurisdiction. They no longer had the authority to hear those claims. Instead, that jurisdiction was awarded or given to the tribunal. The tribunal shall have jurisdiction to render final determination on all these claims. So, for personal injury, medical conditions, illnesses, sicknesses, in 1991, the tribunal adopted a program patterned after the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which the U.S. Congress had enacted in 1990. In that U.S. law, the Congress said, oh, people living around the Nevada test site where atomic tests were done, small tests, nothing big like here in the Marshall Islands. People living around those places in the Nevada test site area, the fallout emitted from atmospheric nuclear tests at the Nevada test site exposed people, quote, to radiation that is presumed to have generated an excess of cancers among those individuals who lived in affected areas during the periods of atmospheric testing in Nevada. Those areas include places that are 450, actually later versions, 500 miles away from the Nevada test site. Those places are included in this law, where Congress says we presume that anybody that lived in these areas during those times that they were testing atomic bombs in Nevada, anybody who lived in those areas during those times was exposed, presumed to have, was exposed to radiation, and that radiation was presumed to have caused cancers among those people. So, this program, RACA, R-A-C-A, Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, says that for anybody who was living in those areas, those affected areas, in Nevada, also in Arizona and Utah, places as far as 500 miles away from the Nevada test site where the bombs were detonated, and who developed a medical condition on a list. The original list for the U.S. people was 13 conditions. It's now 21, I think. will receive a $50,000 payment. $50,000 lump sum payment. Well, the tribunal looked at that as a sample and said, well, that's a good way to do this, because we don't know what people's exposure levels were. It's going to be very difficult to prove how much radiation any one particular person was exposed to. We know what the levels were at Rongelat and Utrecht fairly well, but still, what about people from the other atolls? There's no way they can prove that they were exposed. So we will follow the example of this US program created by the Congress, which says people are presumed to have been exposed to radiation from the atomic bombs tested in Nevada. No thermonuclear, no hydrogen bombs tested in Nevada. And that exposure that they received is presumed to have generated an excess of cancers. So the tribunal said, fine, we'll take that list of 13 conditions that the US Congress has provided, and we will add to it these first 13 conditions, starting with leukemia, cancer of the thyroid, working down to cancer of the liver. Those are the 13 conditions in the radiation exposure compensation program for the civilians, people living around the Nevada test site. Many times you will hear those people referred to as downwinders. That the wind was blowing from the Nevada test site toward the places that they lived, so they were downwind, and it was that wind that carried the fallout that maybe caused their exposure to radiation. But the tribunal wasn't satisfied to stop at just those 13, because we realized, with some expert testimony from a medical doctor at the U.S. National Cancer Institute, Dr. Robert Miller, that there were other medical conditions that could be caused by exposure to radiation. Dr. Miller had worked for many years in Hiroshima at a place called the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, studying what kind of illnesses were the Japanese developing, the survivors. I mean, we know that more than 180,000 Japanese were killed within a short period of time, a year or less, following the bombs that were dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But what about those who survived, who were exposed to some of the radiation from those bombs, but who didn't die as a result, and who survived? What kind of medical conditions are developing in them? What kind of cancers, what kind of other illnesses, sicknesses are developing? And Dr. Miller had worked for that organization originally when it was formed following the World War II. It was called the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. Later its name was changed to the Radiation Effects Research Foundation. And that has been one of the main sources of knowledge about what radiation can cause in the way of medical illnesses. And Dr. Miller was very familiar with them. So he came to Madrigal in December of 1989 at the request of the Nuclear Claims Tribunal to advise the judges and the officers of the tribunal as to what medical conditions can be caused by radiation. And based on Dr. Miller's recommendations, the tribunal expanded that original list of 13 to the point that initially in 1991, when the tribunal put its program into effect, we compensated for 25 medical conditions. We did something else that was different than the U.S. program. The U.S. program awarded $50,000 no matter what condition you had for these 13. And we had medical doctors advising us, and we asked them, well, what's the effect of these conditions on a person's quality of life? How sick do you get if you have any of these conditions? And the doctors advised us that, for example, if you have cancer of the thyroid, you may need to have surgery to remove that cancer, but you won't die from that cancer. Thyroid cancer, only if it's completely left untreated and it spreads to other parts of your body, that's the only way that anyone could die of thyroid cancer. On the other hand, leukemia, especially considering that we can't provide treatment for leukemia, even now, here in Majuro. Surely we couldn't provide treatment for leukemia in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So if you develop leukemia, basically, that means you're going to die. Is it fair to give the same amount of money to a person that has leukemia as you give to someone that has thyroid cancer? The tribunal decided, no, that's not fair. So we will follow the US in terms of cancer of the thyroid. If it does not recur, even if you have surgery, but you only have one surgery, we'll pay the same $50,000 that the US program would pay. That's fair. Someone in the States gets thyroid cancer, someone around Nevada test site, someone who lived maybe 500 miles away from the Nevada test site, they develop a thyroid cancer, they'll get $50,000, we'll pay the same amount to someone here. But someone who develops leukemia or other conditions that are much more serious, that will have a much greater impact on the quality of life of that individual, we will award higher amounts of compensation, all the way up to $125,000. So leukemia was to come in at $125,000. Thyroid cancer, if you have to have 2 surgeries for your cancer because they don't get it all the first time, and that happened to a lot of people here, then we'll increase your compensation to $75,000 because that means your thyroid cancer was more serious than others. And cancer of the breast, $75,000. If you have to have a mastectomy where they totally remove a breast, $100,000. And you can see these amounts, $100,000, $125,000. Some of the other conditions that the tribunal added to the list based on the recommendations from Dr. Miller were salivary gland tumor, okay, same as thyroid tumor, $50,000. What about even a salivary gland tumor that didn't require surgery? Oh, $12,500. That's not even a cancer. It's just a benign tumor. Same with non-malignant thyroid nodular disease. We have had hundreds of people in the Marshall Islands develop what is called a thyroid nodule. It's something that grows on their thyroid. You can feel it through the skin of their neck if you're a medical doctor and you've been trained in how to do what they call palpation. They can feel these nodules. And many of the patients had ultrasound examination. You may have seen an ultrasound machine. It can take a picture through your skin. It's sort of like an X-ray. And it can identify these nodules. The doctors working for the Department of Energy, for the Atomic Energy Commission, in examining Roundup and Utari people, they recognized that these people were developing thyroid nodules. They're not cancerous, they're not malignant, they are benign, but they interfere with these people's ability to swallow. Many people have said, I used to have a very good singing voice, but once the thyroid nodule started to grow, my voice changed and it wasn't as good. And many people, including the Roundup and Utari people, had surgery to remove the nodule. And then they would put the tissue that they removed from the thyroid under a very powerful magnifying glass, and they would check to see if it was cancer or not. Oh no, it's not. Okay, so it's just a thyroid nodule. Well, in that case, the tribunal would award $12,500 for a nodule not requiring surgery. If you had to have the surgery to remove the nodule, a partial thyroidectomy, the compensation would increase to $37,500. And if you had to have a total thyroidectomy, in other words, they remove both lobes of your thyroid, then the compensation would be the same as for a thyroid cancer, $50,000. So we added these conditions in 1991. This was the list. 25 conditions for which the tribunal awarded compensation in different amounts ranging from $12,500 to $125,000. A factor of 10 different, 10 times the lowest amount for the highest award. Over the years though, based on additional medical input from my office's medical advisor, Dr. Radford, who had been on Kwajalein in 1948, the tribunal eventually added 11 more conditions so that we wound up with total of 36 medical conditions for which the tribunal awarded compensation to people who were living in the Marshall Islands during the period of nuclear weapons testing. And over the years, from 1991, when the program went into effect, the tribunal's personal injury compensation program, if you have one of these conditions, you receive this amount of money. The awards were made to or on behalf of 2,127 people. Some of those people, a few hundred of those people, had already died when someone else came and made a claim to the tribunal. But the tribunal would award compensation to the dead person and then say to the family, you need to go to the high court and find out who we should pay this award to, because this award is to somebody that's not alive anymore. We don't know who to pay it to, but the high court would conduct what they call probate proceedings, determine who the beneficiaries of the award should be, and who the person would be that would be administering payment of the awards. Also, if you look at the 177 agreement, the section talking about the tribunal and in particular about payment of its awards, the 177 agreement says all compensation awards must be paid on an annual prorated basis. That means that every year the tribunal would make a payment on an award. When we made the very first awards in August of 1991, the tribunal made an initial payment of 20% of the award, 1/5. So if someone had a thyroid cancer, the award would be $50,000, and the initial payment that was made, 20%, would be $10,000. That was in August and September of 1991. The tribunal's payments came every October. The tribunal could take $3.25 million from the fund every October. So in October 1991, when we got some additional funding, we said, okay, let's make another payment to everyone that has an award, and that payment was in the amount of 5%. And then every new award that was made from October 91 through September of 92 received the same total of 25%, the 20% plus the 5% that the earlier group had received. So everybody was even. And that continued. In 93, 92, the tribunal made an 8% annual payment on all the awards. And that brought everyone to 33%. And for the next year, all new awards received 33% as their initial payment. The following year was 7%, then it was 10%, then it was 5% again, which brought the initial payment for new awards by 1996 to 55% of the award. More than half would be your initial payment. But then the tribunal had gotten to the point where we're not going to have enough money to pay everybody every dollar that we award. There isn't going to be enough money. The fund was going down, on its way down to 40-some million by 2001. It was not producing anywhere near the $18 million every year. And even though the tribunal was continuing to get $3.25 million every year, that was not going to be enough to make initial payments to everybody of more than half of their award. So we reduced the amounts down, and we had to continue reducing them as we got up to this more than 2,000 people receiving compensation. The total amount of the awards that the tribunal made was almost $96.7 million. But by the time that we made the final award in December 2008, the tribunal had only been able to make payments, actual payment, of only $73.5 million. Some people, those people whose awards had been approved in 1991 through 96, they ultimately received 91% of their award, more than 90% of their award in payment. But the people who came later, some got 60-some%, some got 30-some%, some got only 5%. They only received an initial payment of 5% of their award. If you had a thyroid cancer and the award, your document, your award order says the tribunal is going to award you $50,000 for your thyroid cancer, and in the latter years, 2006, 7, and 8, the tribunal said, but we are only going to be able to make one payment to you in the amount of 5%. So those people received a payment of $2,500, 5%, 1/20th of their award, and that's it. The tribunal still owes them $47,500. We were only able to pay 5%, $2,500 of their award. So there's an unpaid balance of $23.1 million to these 2,000 some people. No one received full payment. The most that anybody got was 91%. That's the personal injury compensation. Now let's turn to the property damage. Property damage means damage to your island, your atoll. And the claims for property damage were decided through comprehensive adjudicatory proceedings addressing many complex issues. What I mean by a complicated adjudicatory proceeding is this was just like a big case in court. The people of the 4 atolls each had their own attorneys. Their lawyers filed the claims. At the tribunal, there was an office called the Defender of the Fund. He was an attorney, and he could hire his own scientists to argue against an award of compensation for property damage. And the tribunal held long hearings and required detailed reports from scientists, land valuation experts, and other people, and eventually decided that there were 3 kinds of damage for which it would award compensation. Radiological cleanup and restoration. Okay. Eniwetok. There was a partial cleanup done at Eniwetok. They did not clean up the northern islands. They thought they're too radioactive to clean up. It'll cost too much money. How much would it cost to clean up the whole atoll? Why should the Eniwetok people have to only stay and live on part of their atoll? They had the use of their entire atoll, full and unrestricted use, before the U.S. came in and started exploding atomic and thermonuclear bombs. Why shouldn't they have the full atoll cleaned up? So that was one type of award that was made. Another type was loss of use of land due to contamination and or exile. The Eniwetok people were moved from their atoll to Ujilam in 1947. The partial cleanup, of only the southern islands in the atoll, was completed in 1980, after 33 years of living in exile at Ujilam. The people were allowed to return. You cannot compare Eniwetok and Ujilam. Ujilam is a very remote, isolated, desolate atoll. It had been washed over by a tidal wave in the early 1900s. There was no topsoil there. One of the expert witnesses for the Eniwetok people in their property damage claim showed us photographs of people at Ujilam. When they had finished cooking the evening meal out on ground fire, they would have the children bring rocks from the ocean side and put them into the fire as it was dying down, because the heat of the fire would create internal fractions in those rocks, and the next morning they could take hammers and pound those rocks into sand so that they could make some soil to try to grow plants in, to grow food in. It was unbelievable for us to see this evidence that was brought about how desolate it was, how difficult it was to grow things at Ujilam. So the value of Eniwetok was much greater than the value of Ujilam. The tribunal looked at this situation and said, okay, it's just like if we asked you to leave your house. We want to rent your house. Let's just say Eniwetok is your house. If you're an Eniwetok person, it's your home. It's where you've been born. It's where all your ancestors have been. It's your chole. It's your treasure. And somebody comes and says, oh, can you move out so that we can move in? And instead we'll put you, instead of this nice big atoll that, you know, maybe there's not as much rain in Eniwetok as there is here in Majuro, but still, they had a lot of different plants, food plants that they could eat. And they could go to the northern islands and harvest food that was growing there. And the Eniwetok people were very good sailors. They could sail across that lagoon easily, go pick up some food from other islands in the atoll, bring it back to wherever they were living, and support themselves. Now you put them at Ujilam instead. It's like if you move out of a big house with 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, and we put you in a small little room. Well, that's not fair. You've lost the use of your home, and you're not getting the same type of place to stay in. So the tribunal determined that loss of use would be a major component of the awards of compensation for damage to property. And finally, we talk about consequential damages. The hardship and suffering that people had to endure while living in a place like Ujilam, or in the case of the Bikinians, first living in Rongerik, then living in Kili. A single island that has no lagoon, nothing like the resources that Bikini had. So, fine, we had those 3 types of damage. The Eniwetok award of compensation, property damage compensation, was decided in the year 2000, and based on scientific reports from experts, it was decided that there needed to be another $107 million, $107.8 million, to clean up the other islands in the atoll that the U.S. had not cleaned up between 1970 and 78 and 1980. $100 million for more cleanup. For the past and future loss, because many of the islands in Eniwetok, until you clean them up, you can't use them. They're still too radioactive to go live there, way too radioactive to eat food that grows there. So there wasn't just the past loss of use from 47 to 80, those 33 years when they were at Ujilam, but there was the future loss of use of many islands in the atoll, not the entire atoll, but many islands in the atoll that to this day are still too radioactive. So for that loss of use, the tribunal awarded $244 million. And then for the consequential damages, the hardship and suffering that the Eniwetok people received, the tribunal awarded an additional $34 million. So that the total award in the year 2000 was about $386 million, nearly $386 million total for the people of Eniwetok. That award was made in the year 2000. 2 payments were made on that award, 2 very small payments. The first in 2002, the second in 2003, totaling about $1.6 million. Excuse me, if I give you $386 million on paper, I say I owe you $386 million, but I only pay you $1.6 million, does that seem fair? I still owe you $384 million. This is part of the unfair aspect because the funding in the settlement agreement never reached that $18 million per year, never reached the amounts that were necessary to make full payment of the personal injury awards, and not even close to making even substantial payment on the property damage awards. We have this amount owing to the Eniwetok people. In the year 2001, the tribunal issued its decision on the Bikini claim. $251 million for cleanup, $278 million for loss of use, $33 million, almost $34 million for consequential damages, hardship, and suffering. Total of $563 million in award of compensation. At the same time as it made small payments to the people at Eniwetok, it made small payments to the people at Bikini, 2002 and 2003, totaling almost $2.3 million. Big deal. The tribunal still owes those people more than $561 million for their property damage awards. Nothing has been paid since 2003. Next, the tribunal heard the property damage claim for Utrecht. And it decided that maybe there's not really much need to do a cleanup, but we want to do some soil treatment. The DOE scientists have learned that if you spread a fertilizer on the ground where your food plants are growing, a fertilizer that contains potassium, the plants will actually prefer to take up the potassium from the soil, and they'll leave the cesium, the radioactive cesium-137, in the soil. So if you treat the soil with a potassium-based fertilizer, you reduce the amount of radioactive cesium that goes into those plants that people eat, so therefore you reduce their exposures. So the plan would be to do soil treatment at Utrecht and do some monitoring and give them $5 million, not necessarily cleanup, just do more monitoring and soil treatment. For their impaired property use, they were only gone from Utrecht for 3 months. But effectively, they should not have been back at Utrecht for many of those years from 1954, when they were evacuated from that 3-month period, until the present, or at least until the time of the award in 2006, because they were living in a radioactive environment. They should not have been using it. So it's what we call impaired property use. You didn't have good, full use. You were using a place that was damaged, and that could damage you. So the tribunal awarded $257 million for that type of impaired use, and $45 million for the consequential damages, the hardship and suffering, and in the case of the Utrecht people, it was also for the mental anguish, for the anxiety, for the worries that they have had in their minds for many, many years. Wait a second, why are we were moved back to Utrecht after only 3 months on Kwajalein. The Rongelap people spent 3 or 4 months on Kwajalein and then 3 years in Majuro before they were moved back. And then they moved again in 1985. And the U.S. Congress said, oh, we'll give the Rongelap people $45 million to clean up their atoll, because, right, they shouldn't have been living there. Anyway, the total award for the Utrecht people, $307 million. Payment, zero. They've never been paid $1. So the tribunal still owes them, because by the time this award was made in 2006, the tribunal had already reduced its initial payment for personal injury awards to 5%, and it said, we cannot afford to make a payment on the Utrecht award. In 2007, the tribunal issued its decision in the Rongelap property damage claim, finding that it would take an additional $212 million to clean up the entire atoll. The loss of use, past and future loss of use. And here we're talking about not just Rongelap, but also Rongerik and Eilingenei, because those 3 atolls were all part of the same community. And because Rongelap has more acres, and the tribunal was awarding compensation for loss of use based on a rental, depending on how many acres of land you had. Rongelap, Rongerik, and Eilingenei have more than 3,000 acres. Bikini, Utrecht, and Eniwetok all have less than 2,000 acres. So, in making an award based on so many dollars per acre per year, the award for the Rongelap loss of use, including Rongerik and Eilingenei, was $784 million for past and future loss of use, and for consequential damages, the suffering, hardship, being subjected to medical studies by the DOE doctors who will come and take blood samples, take urine samples. They want to always stick a needle in you. They want you to sit in this chair, have how much radiation in your body measured. 34, almost 35 million. A total of, this is more than 1 billion with a B, because it's $1,031 million, the total award for the property damage in Rongelap. Amount paid, zero. Total owing, more than $1 billion. So just to recap the work of the tribunal as far as compensation awards is concerned. Summary of unpaid awards. Personal injury awards, balance owed, more than $23.1 million. If you combine the different components of the property damage claim in those 4 atolls, Eniwetok, Bikini, Rongelap, and Utrik, more than $531 million was awarded for cleanup of those 4 atolls. None of that has ever been paid. And more than $1.5 billion was awarded for loss of use. $1.6 million was paid to Eniwetok, $2.3 million to Bikini, but that still leaves about $1.5 billion. And more than $148 million for hardship, suffering, and consequential damages. The total amount of the unpaid compensation awards made by the tribunal, more than $2.3 billion. We're still waiting for a response from the U.S. Congress to a petition that the Marshall Islands government submitted in the year 2000. At that point, the initial award for Eniwetok had been made, but the other 3 atolls, Bikini, Utrik, and Rongelap, those awards had not been made. But over the years, since those awards were made, the U.S. Congress has been informed, this is the amount that is owed now, and we're waiting for payment. This is something that you've probably heard the term changed circumstances petition. You're aware that Article 9 of the Section 177 agreement is changed circumstances. That's the basis on which the RMI approached the U.S. Congress in 2000. And I believe that they will be approaching the U.S. Congress again, perhaps this year or perhaps sometime next year, to say, to submit a new petition, additional justification for these unpaid awards to actually be paid. So that's a summary of the settlement agreement, which was not a fair and just and adequate settlement. But there's provision in that agreement where the U.S. can say it's full and final, and you cannot go back to U.S. courts anymore, or a U.S. court might order the U.S. government to pay this amount, or perhaps the U.S. court would say, oh, well, we don't agree with the tribunal that it should be $1 billion for Rongelap, maybe only $500 million. Okay, fine, make that decision and order the U.S. government to pay it. But the people in the Marshall Islands cannot take their claims to U.S. courts anymore because of the Section 177 agreement. I've used up more than your last time, but I hope you have some better understanding of the unfair nature of the settlement agreement and the remaining unfair and unjust legacy of the nuclear weapons testing program that people in the Marshall Islands continue to suffer from.
Okay, let's give him a hand. Anybody? Questions?
Well, I got a lot of questions, but actually if I could get your email, that might be a better way to address them, so that we're not taking up too much of YCP's time.
I'm notorious bad correspondent.
Oh. I gotta find you out and about, huh?
Maybe that would be better.
Okay, Bill, because we ran out of time, the plan is, we'll have the students, write their questions, and I'll email the list of questions.
Okay, yeah.
If you have answers for them, then I'll.
Your instructor has my email address, so.
Okay.
Okay.
Como estava?
Or maybe somebody can unplug the projector and maybe